Okay.
And the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Carrie, and thank you all for joining me this morning. Um, uh, Given the lack of an introducer, I will introduce myself ever so briefly. Um, I'm the former Dean of Medicine and Biological Sciences at Brown, but by background, I'm an trained obstetrician gynecologist and a reproductive endocrinologist. Perhaps my most important distinction is that I spent 15 happy years at the University of Maryland, towards which I still harbor very warm feelings and have made it a practice of visiting at least annually when possible. This year, regrettably, we have to do this virtually, but so it goes. No other option really existed. The subject matter of today's presentation is the Belmont report at 40. It'll become apparent later what the Belmont report is, but it's all about the resetting of human subject research, or if you will, it's the story behind the IRB, which all of you must be in some form or another familiar. And in a sense, what I will try to take you through is the history that led us to this concept of the IRB, which now undergirds every form of human subject research that is undertaken in the United States. My only conflict is illustrated in this slide. Humanism, which is what all of this is about, is defined by the American Humanist Association as a secular philosophy that commits one to an ethical life of purpose. The Belmont report is very much in this spirit, in that it introduced for the first time humanism and ethics to clinical research in the United States. In effect, it shifted the emphasis from the investigator to the research subject. It shifted the ethos from the old-fashioned investigator knows best to IRB adjudication. And lastly, it shifted the ethics of human subject research from the utilitarian variety to its deontologic counterpart, which is to say that it no longer equated morality with the outcome of the research. In other words, the statement was always, the risk is worth the insights gained, and the subject matter be secondary, to the morality really is to be judged by the ethical code. In other words, the risk is not worth the insight gained. In other words, it's not worth risking individuals who volunteer for clinical research simply because insights will be gained, which was prevalent, obviously, prior to the Belmont report, a point to which we will come back to. Which brings me to a poignant quote, which reads, "Ethics and science need to shake hands." I found that quite enlightening, and in tracing it, turns out it's attributed to Richard Clark Cabot, who was the chair of the Department of Social Ethics at Harvard University in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And that particular quote can be found in the introduction to his 1933 book, The Meaning of Right and Wrong. It doesn't get much better than that. It's the ultimate book, if you will, on ethics. Essentially, what Dr. Cabot pointed out is that when science and ethics collide, we need to call in the bioethics brigade, which will then adjudicate the conflict. In a sense, what the ethics brigade will seek to do is to arrive at a moral right, if we can call it that, and arrive at a moral code that we can all abide by, which brings us now very close to the Belmont report, which was a code of conduct when it comes to human subject research. In the next few slides, however, I'd like to go with you over the history of these codes, because the Belmont Code was really the last code to be developed if you look at it from the point of view of the history of mankind. And so when you look at the history of codes for human subject research, you have to go back all the way to 1900 to what was known as the Prussian Directive, which was followed in 1931 by the Weimar Guidelines, and I'll elaborate on all of those, to 1947 and the so-called Nuremberg Code, which followed the Second World War, to 1964 and the Declaration of Helsinki, which I imagine most of you are familiar with, and ultimately the Belmont Report, which dates back to 1979. The Prussian Directive, which was the first code, was titled Instructions for the Directors of Clinics, Outpatient Clinics, and Other Medical Facilities, and was the product of the then Kingdom of Prussia, then ruled by German Emperor and King Wilhelm II. It was a foundational and foresighted directive, which even then introduced the concept of the principle of respect for persons and the precept of informed consent, which of course is still very valid today as a binding legal construct. Remember, the year was 1900. What was discussed by the Prussia Directive but was excluded from the final document were the principles of beneficence, that is to say the risk-benefit ratio to the subjects, the principle of justice, which takes into account vulnerable populations, such as pregnant women, and the precept of preclinical studies first, which is a notion I'd like to come back to because it is no longer valid, or at least should be frowned upon. I'll come back to that point later. What was perhaps the most progressive about the year 900 Prussian Directive was the following statement, which was made by Ludwig von Bahr, a lawyer who was evidently a consultant to the Prussian minister. And what he said was, respect for rights and morality is just as important as medical and scientific progress, which is exactly what the Belmont Report is about, the IRB principle is about, and contemporary outlook is about when it comes to human subject research. However, at the time, this ran counter to the prevailing view of physicians and scientists who maintain that doctor knows best. That's an attitude that maybe your parents or grandparents were quite familiar with, but is obviously, thankfully, no longer with us, hopefully in a meaningful way. In 1931, we were introduced to the so-called Weimar Guidelines, which were titled The German Guidelines on Human Experimentation. Please note that this was the product of the pre-Nazi Weimar Republic, which surpassed its predecessor, the Prussian Directive, by adding the principle of beneficence to the document, and by, again, embracing the precept of preclinical studies first, to which I will come back later, or perhaps, in fact, I'll say something now, and also the requirement of a detailed study protocol. By preclinical studies first, we understand today studies that will be conducted with experimental animals for the most part, or in vitro in tissue culture. The issue of experimentation with animals, even though it's still a fact of life, I think we all recognize has its moral shortcomings. This becomes particularly apparent when you begin thinking about experimentation with non-human primates, whose evolutionary proximity to us makes them quasi-human. And so, while we still need preclinical studies and probably cannot do without them at this time in the absence of a substitute, it's important to state that it's not free of a moral dilemma, and that we are uncomfortable in general and struggling with that notion. And for that matter, there is a significant movement out there that seeks to bring an end to the notion of preclinical studies using animals. This is a difficult moral issue that probably deserves a separate conversation, but I wanted to at least mention it in the interest of completeness. The Weimar Guidelines discussed but excluded from the final document institutional review boards, believe it or not, a notion that came up in 1931, quite some time before we embraced this concept as a binding operational principle. And they did make a distinction between non-therapeutic and therapeutic research, which is another problematic area which prevailed at the time. The idea that you could simply try things on patients simply because they were available and because you know best. That, of course, is no longer tenable, and we do not subscribe to the notion of therapeutic research, meaning on real patients. Rather, every form of research must be approved by an IRB before it is applied, whether it is to patients or to individuals who are otherwise well. The import of the Weimar Guidelines notwithstanding, it's important to note that the Weimar Guidelines, not unlike their Prussian directive, were largely discounted by the medical establishment of the day on the grounds that abuses are rare, which we hear today as well, and that investigators know best. So back in 1931, the Weimar Guidelines went against the grain. The medical and scientific establishment still was not ready for the idea that their work should be subject to some evaluation and potential criticism. Another important point to make is that the Weimar Guidelines, though technically in force through 1945, they were relegated before too long to bearing silent witness to the indescribable atrocities of the Nazi era. So between 1933 and 1945, everything we know about the reign of the Third Reich was clearly detached from the otherwise enlightened Weimar Guidelines, which were summarily ignored throughout the period of the Nazi regime. Which brings us to the Nuremberg Code in 1947, which was the product of the Nuremberg doctors' trial for crimes against humanity by the Nazi regime, and specifically by the doctors who represented it in concentration camps and elsewhere. It added to the earlier codes the precept of scientifically qualified personnel conducting the research, the right of research subjects to withdraw, which we still respect, of course, today, and the obligation of PIs to discontinue a study if warranted, which is a function that today has been assumed by the so-called Data Monitoring Committee, which overlooks an ongoing study and has the authority to discontinue a study if the data appear to warrant it, which is to say, high incidence of mortality, major morbidity, good reasons that suggest that the study is too risky and that it must be discontinued. Jay Katz, the former Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Law, Medicine, and Psychiatry at Yale, who was a distinguished scholar of human subject research, offered his following assessment of the Nuremberg Code. He said, "The judges, in the most uncompromising language, suggested that the tensions between progress in medical science and the inviolability of research subjects must be resolved in favor of respect for the person, his or her self-determination and autonomy." In other words, he viewed the Nuremberg Code as, by then, probably the best example of a code that truly understood and respected the self-determination and autonomy of research subjects that just comes with the territory. Which brings us to the Declaration of Helsinki of 1964, which was the product of the World Medical Association. The general principles of the declaration were respect for persons, beneficence, justice, and the notion of therapeutic research, which they retained, that is to say, research conducted as part of medical care, albeit absent IRB adjudication. In a word, we're looking at the hybrid product. On the one hand, it was fairly advanced. The first three principles are almost identical to the ones we now subscribe to in the Belmont report. But the fourth principle, as we mentioned earlier, is no longer valid. We don't experiment on patients. And if we do, we would have gone through an IRB committee to receive permission to do so, presumably for very good reasons. But it's not up to a doctor, individual doctor, or individual researcher to experiment on patients just because he or she feels that it is useful, informative, and or will advance science. This is something that the Declaration of Helsinki, I think, missed. There were subsequent versions of the Declaration of Helsinki, and in subsequent declarations, this particular element was deleted. Therapeutic research may well have given rise, if we think about it in hindsight, to calamities such as the thalidomide affair. Even in the United States, which largely escaped that affair, the company distributed, as was customary in those days, samples to many physicians in the United States who did distribute it, including to pregnant patients. And it's not as if the United States didn't have cases of thalidomide babies, it did. Not that many as in Europe, but it did. And some of those sued the company, and successfully so. So we don't want to get into those situations which essentially stem from therapeutic research. Doctors try it out, if you will, without really having been cleared to do so. And the Belmont report, as you will see, explicitly states any research should undergo review for the protection of human subjects. The most charitable characterization one could afford for the so-called therapeutic research notion is that it approximates what we call compassionate use, which is sort of the last resort that we have working for us with the FDA, which in some unusual circumstances might allow one to use a medication that has not been fully approved, but is showing promise. But that's a rare exception and clearly does not make the rule. Which brings us to the Belmont report in 1979, and the question, why another code? Why do we need another code? And why a US code? Why not embrace one of the predecessors that we just described? Well, the reason that we needed a US code was the documented persistence of unethical human subject research in the United States. And the absence of a binding national ethical code, since earlier codes were never widely embraced and or systematically followed in the United States. And up to that point, there were, of course, no IRBs. So it was a no man's land. And clinical research still proceeded many times unethically and without an ethical code. Our attention to the reality of unethical research in the United States was drawn by Henry Beecher, who was the chair of the Department of Anesthesiology at Harvard Medical School, and who published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1966 titled Examples of Unethical or Questionably Ethical Studies. In that paper, he listed 23 of 50 such documented studies. I'll show you a few examples of those. One study, which also saw press in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1952, was titled The Syndrome of Impending Hepatic Coma in Patients with Cirrhosis of the Liver, given certain nitrogenous substances. Essentially, the paper revolved around 9 patients with advanced liver cirrhosis who were administered nitrogenous products without consent, with an eye towards precipitating an impending hepatic coma. This was a form of therapeutic research, as we mentioned earlier. Doctors decided that they had a question to test, and they tested it on patients without consent, creating significant risk, of course, for the individuals who slipped into hepatic coma and in some cases died. Another example of unethical research in the United States in those days dates back to 1964. This was known as the Cancer Immunity Study, and it made the front page of the New York Times. That study involved the administration of cancer cells that were injected into non-cancerous patients without their consent during experiments. Again, something that would be looked at today with amazement, but at the time was considered standard fare. Doctors knew best, and here you have another example of so-called therapeutic research. Topping it all off, of course, was the Tuskegee syphilis study, which came to widespread attention on July the 25th, 1972, when it made the front page of the New York Times. As many of you probably know, the Tuskegee syphilis study was a 40-year study carried out by the US Public Health Service, involved 400 poor, disease-stricken Black men from Macon County, Alabama, who were deliberately left untreated for 40 years in the name of studying the natural history of the disease. In other words, they were known to have syphilis, and instead of being afforded treatment, limited and perhaps primitive as it was at the time, but there were treatments, if you recall, they were allowed to proceed untreated in the name of studying the natural history of the disease. This was essentially the straw that broke the camel's back and drove the country into action and Congress into action, which ultimately led to the Belmont report. Congress held hearings, and I'm only showing two of those, in 1973 on this very matter. Notice the title, Biomedical Research Ethics and the Protection of Human Research Subjects, for example, or The Quality of Healthcare, Human Experimentation, 1973, all triggered by the Tuskegee syphilis study. Until such time in 1974, after a lot of give and take between Democratic and Republican lawmakers, which at the time were largely shepherded by the late Senator Kennedy, Congress arrived at an agreement that they would establish a commission. And they passed a law which was titled the National Research Act of 1974, Title II of which was known as Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And it was about establishing a commission that would study the issue and establish guidelines. Specifically, what Congress instructed the commission to do was, quote, to find the critical balance required to satisfy society's demands for the advancement of knowledge while abiding by its strictures to protect dignity, privacy, and freedom of its individual members. This was a federal commission unlike any other. No previous federal commission was convened heretofore to define the ethical moorings of public policy of any kind. In this case, it was to be human subject research. No previous federal commission was obliged to conduct all of its deliberations in public, which this commission did. And no previous federal commission was granted what is known as action forcing authority on the Department of Health and Human Services, which means any and all recommendations of the commission were binding on the Department of Health and Human Services. In other words, they were to enact them, put them into code, and essentially make them the law of the land. And that's how we arrived at the current IRB concept. This was unheard of up to that point. It hasn't happened much after that, but it's probably the only way to assure that commission reports don't end up languishing on somebody's shelf, but rather get implemented and acted upon. The commission was to be comprised of 11 commissioners It was to convene monthly in Washington, D.C., which they did for 3 or 4 years. And it was to elect its own chair. I make this point because the chair that the commission elected was Kenneth J. Ryan, MD, who was the Kate Macy Ladd and William Lambert Richardson Professor of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Medicine at Harvard Medical School. I suspect that some of the senior members of the audience recognize the name. It's likely that the residents may or may not recognize the name. It's useful to note, however, that Dr. Ryan at the time was probably the best known obstetrician gynecologist in the nation by virtue of his accomplishments, but also by virtue of his position as the chair of the department at Harvard Medical School. And so I'll take a minute to just say a word or two about who Dr. Ryan was and why a commission that was comprised of all kinds of people chose to elect him as their leader. Dr. Ryan was double boarded in medicine and obstetrics and gynecology. He did his training at the MGH and at the Brigham. Or actually, I shouldn't say that, at the predecessor of the Brigham, the so-called lying-in hospital, which eventually joined forces with the Peterben Brigham to form Brigham and Women's Hospital, which as we know it today. He carried out seminal work on placenta aromatization, which stands to this day. It wasn't really known that the placenta aromatized androgens to estrogens prior to that time. It was a remarkable discovery. He was initially chair of the Department of OBGYN at Case Western Reserve for 9 years. He briefly moved to UCSD for 3 years before they recruited him to follow the retiring chair at Harvard, a position he held for the next 20 years. The Belmont report, which was authored by the commission, was really just one of 11 reports that the commission issued. It happened to be the last. And it was 20 pages short and was first released on September the 3rd, 1978, and then formally a year later. You might ask, what's in the name? Why the Belmont report? Well, the report was named after a retreat that was held by the commission at the Belmont estate in Elk Ridge, Maryland, which some of you may or may not have visited. At the time, it was maintained by the Smithsonian Institution, but I believe since that time, and the retreat took place in February of 1976, between the 13th and the 16th. Since that time, the Belmont estate has been taken over by Howard County, I'm pretty sure, and this is more or less what it looks like when this pandemic is one day behind us. Perhaps you can pay a visit. It's not all that far from where you are right now. But that's where the commission met for 3 days and wrote the report. And because of the location, the report was named the Belmont Report. It's that prosaic. The Belmont principles, in a way, are not original in the sense that they reflect some of the principles we already enunciated. Respect for person, that is to say, respect for the autonomy of the research subject, and the obligation of securing informed consent. Beneficence, or according to some, non-maleficence, is all about the risk-benefit ratio. Is this study really important enough to warrant the risk that we impose on the research subjects? Never mind how limited that risk may be. And finally, the principle of justice, both individual and social, that has at its heart vulnerable populations of subjects. I mentioned pregnant women earlier. Children, of course, come under that heading. Patients in psychiatric institutions fall under that heading, and several other categories. There you have to exercise extra caution before you consider recruiting research subjects from these vulnerable populations. Perhaps the most noteworthy point about the Belmont report is its staying power. Remember, it's 40 years old, and it was all really created by a single report. And the question is, why? I think we know the answer to that. First of all, the commission didn't just write the Belmont report, they also wrote a report on institutional review boards. So they made it possible for the Department of Health and Human Services to write both concepts into law. The IRB idea on the one hand, and the principles that would guide it on the other. And because it had what we call action forcing committee, action forcing authority, the Belmont Commission was able to, in a sense, dictate to the Department of Health and Human Services to write into the Code of Federal Regulations both the IRB notion and the principles thereof. This is now known as the, quote, common rule, which governs institutional review boards and thereby makes oversight of human subject research possible. Every federal governmental agency has to abide by this rule, and of course, every human subject research in the academic enterprise or in the private sector has to be approved by an IRB. All of this is overseen to this day by OHRP, the Office for Human Research Protections, which was formed much later than the Belmont report in about 2000. Its predecessor was known as the Office of Protection from Research Risks, and it's reporting directly to the Assistant Secretary of Health. The present director of OHRP is both a physician and a lawyer, and he reports to whoever is the Assistant Secretary of Health, or ASH, at the time. The parties we all have to thank for and recognize for getting us here are really the crafters of the earlier codes dating back to 1900. Congress, which back in 1973 and 74 was a functional entity which engaged in bipartisan conversations, discussions, and consensus. In this case, led on the Democratic side by the late Senator Kennedy, and on the Republican side by Senator Buckley from New York. Those two worked in the tradition of Congress as it existed at the time and found a way to proceed. There were give and takes. Buckley and the Republicans were concerned about some human fetal research that they learned about, presumably funded by the NIH. That's a long story in its own right. And the compromise that was reached was that the commission will, among other things, also write a report about fetal research, which they did. So where there were obstacles, they overcame them by talking it through. And it's thanks to that spirit that we had a law enacted, which established a commission, which wrote the reports, gave us the IRB, and brought us to where we are today, which is a much more civilized state than we could say we were at prior to 1979. And of course, we need to thank the Commission. Theirs was not an insignificant contribution and or commitment. As I said, they were traveling from all over the country to spend 1 weekend a month in Washington and deliberate. They came from all over. Not all of them are still with us today. You notice that Dr. Ryan passed away quite some time ago now. So did quite a few of the other commissioners. The younger members of the commission are still with us. I ended up speaking to all of them. Altogether, I find it to be a remarkable story wherein realities were recognized, action was taken, and a new and far more satisfactory steady state was established. And of course, we need to thank all of you and the innumerable PIs who are conducting clinical investigation in the United States, who are complying with the IRB requirement and with the principles thereof, and therefore are providing us with a humane enterprise when it comes to human subject research. So with that, I will close. I note with satisfaction that we are ahead of ourselves somewhat. So there is some time for question if you have any. But thank you for the opportunity to visit with you virtually. I would much rather this was in shock and trauma auditorium in person. But as I mentioned to Carrie, maybe, just maybe, next September, next October, just maybe.
Fingers crossed, Dr. Adachi, fingers crossed.
I will be in a position to get on a plane, fly to Baltimore, and visit you.
I, for one, and I know I can speak for the department, we really look forward to your visits every year. Thank you so much. I see Dr. Atlas has unmuted his camera.
I have.
Have some things to say, questions to ask.
Well, first of all, Dr. Adachi, it's wonderful to hear your voice and to see you on Zoom. But thank you so much for giving us this lesson in how we've come to where we are today. I think some of our younger colleagues who have to put forth IRB applications are finding, especially at the University of Maryland, quite a tough time getting research done. And I wonder if you could maybe expound on, do you think we've come too far in it? I know at the University of Maryland, it's very difficult to get things forward. And I just want to hear your thoughts on, has the pendulum swung too far in the restrictions or not?
Well, thank you, Bob. And it's good to see you too. It's no substitute to sitting next to you at dinner, but it will have to do. I cannot speak, of course, to the realities of the specific IRB, let's say at Maryland, but it's not infrequent that I hear quote unquote complaints about the quote unquote rigidity, incompliance, ignorance, or worse, of the IRB, because they are, in the final analysis, an obstacle we have to cross. And those of us who would like to get going and get it done would rather that we weren't slowed down and or given a hard time, as we often are. All I can say is that I always like to hope that the IRBs are doing what they're doing with good intentions in mind, that they're not out to harass or harangue applicants, but have the best interest of the human subjects in mind. It varies doubtlessly from institution to institution. Much depends on, as you know, the qualities of the leader of the IRB committee. He or she, I think, can make a big difference in terms of guiding the conversation, limiting the conversation, putting things in perspective. Ideally, you would want somebody with some experience, with good leadership skills, and somebody who is by and large respected, ideally well-liked, who can make things happen one way or the other, presumably in a manner which would do justice to the circumstances of the case. So it's like all regulatory phenomena, they put obstacles in front of us. But I think we can all say, and I'm going to digress for a moment and mention the FDA. It ain't simple to get through the FDA with any drug or device application. But as I mentioned earlier, the FDA is the last barrier between us and a thalidomide-like disaster. And we wouldn't want to be in that position. And in a way, the IRB is a microcosm of that. It's obviously operating on a much smaller scale. The implications are more limited. But I would paraphrase what I just said about thalidomide and say, we don't want to be in a position where we have another Tuskegee or anything like it. Now, that may be a bit strong of a statement, but in the final analysis, that's what the IRB is there for, to make sure that we don't revert to the Wild West that I described to you in Beecher's work, things that today are unthinkable, but at the time were, standard fare. We don't want to go back there. So if the price to pay is, as you suggest, some challenges in the interaction with the IRB, maybe that's a price we should accept.
Thank you, Dr. Adachi, Dr. Kopelman here. Always a pleasure to hear from a gentleman of your wisdom and experience. I was just wondering if you could comment on a more recent phenomenon, which slides into ethics, if not research related, but the rash of publications on COVID and its treatment, many of which have since been retracted, and people jumping on them with such alacrity without the benefit of good peer review. I wonder about your opinion on that area and the ethics of rushing to publication in this situation.
Yeah, thank you, and it's good to see you as well. I cannot say anything that's very definitive. I would characterize some of what's happening anyway as akin to pandemonium. Part of it is understandable in the sense that we're all under a lot of pressure trying to find, if not a cure, then significant palliation. Everybody's out to come up with some solution here. But that is no excuse for shoddy peer review, which led to, as you know, the retraction of some papers by leading journals like The Lancet. It's no excuse for the irresponsible promotion of some therapies by various parties, including the administration. It's no excuse for the politicization of the FDA and the CDC. But that's the reality we presently find ourselves in. It's a peculiar mix of an objective disaster represented by the pandemic and a political disquietude that only makes it more difficult. And that's probably not all that can be said, but in the context of a public meeting, that's probably as far as I would go. But there is no justification for some of the irresponsible behavior and statements that we see out there. And it's very hard for all of us to really pick out those sources of information that we would consider reliable. There are some, clearly, and we want to focus on those to the extent we can and then use our own judgment. But a pandemic is the last circumstance where you want to have to struggle with these issues or to have to make those kinds of choices. But regrettably, that's the reality of the moment. And I wish I had a magic solution for it, but we're going to have to muddle through it for a little bit longer. But hopefully there's something good out there at the end of the day.
Get out there and vote.
Hi, Dr. Adachi. I'm TJ. I'm one of the residents here. I just had hopefully kind of a quick question. You mentioned a good point that, years ago before the Belmont report came about, that the research or studies that they were doing that seemed okay by their standards, but looking back today, we're realizing that a lot of what they did was not okay. And a little bit of my question is asking you to predict the future, but is there anything that you see in today's research standards or today's studies that might end up being, in 20 years, 30 years, we'll look back and say, oh my gosh, what were we thinking? And just what comes to mind for me might be just some of the international research that goes on with participating US institutions, but I just wanted to see if you had any insights into that.
Thank you. I mean, the IRB is not perfect. The enterprise that we put in place is not perfect, but it's a huge step forward. I think what you're suggesting, and I don't disagree with what you say, that it's one thing when the studies are conducted at the University of Maryland or at Stanford or at Brown University. And it's another when it's conducted, let's say, in a developing nation, say in Africa, wherein US interests of one kind or another may well be involved. I am not aware specifically of examples that were such that would cause me to disagree or worse. But I think one needs to be mindful of the fact that the kind of oversight that I think we exercise in the United States is likely not exactly the same in some developing nations who are still struggling with a lot of issues to get to where they need to be. So I think there needs to be simply extra vigilance, and in the final analysis, it's all about people that we're going to have to trust to do the right thing. Will there be abuses? Will there be infractions? Will there be misbehavior? You can almost count on that. It's also part of human nature. Not a day goes by that we don't read or hear about this or that form of misbehavior. So some very serious, some not so serious. But we all need supervision. We all need oversight. Children need oversight. And we're grown-up children who still need some oversight. And since our mothers at this point have abandoned us or have allowed us to move on to the world, we need some other form of oversight, rules, regulations, and laws that would hopefully keep us honest. So I don't have any perfect solution to this, but I'm not blind to what you're suggesting. I hope the infractions are minimal and not consequential, but it's very hard to tell. And these days, with the pressure on to come up with the goods for the pandemic, I think the pressure to take shortcuts, cut corners, may perhaps be more pervasive than they are normally. There is clearly an enormous pressure to come up with, ideally, therapies, secondarily, vaccine, ideally both. And we may be making some headway on both fronts, but we can't rush it. I was pleased to see the FDA as of late put their foot down and make it very clear that they're not likely to take shortcuts. Again, we don't want another thalidomide. And we don't need to go as far as that. If you go back to the polio era, for example, all of you are too young to remember, but the first batch of the vaccine, one of the first batches of vaccine, polio vaccine, that was administered in the United States, was produced by the Qatar laboratories, ended up inducing polio because it wasn't attenuated in some of the children, and it has to be withdrawn. So in the rush to immunize at the time, Qatar, for one reason or another, ended up producing a vaccine that was not a vaccine. It was actually an inoculum. And we really don't want to repeat that kind of situation with the coronavirus vaccine. The last thing you want is to infect people. So a lot of variables in play, and I tried to outline them, perhaps not in the most systematic fashion, but these were the kinds of thoughts that crossed my mind in response to your question.
Thank you.
If we don't have any more questions,
Yeah, I just wanted to say one last thing to Dr. Dashi. It's wonderful seeing you in health. I can tell you that we all here in Baltimore, I know I adored you when you were here, and I was here when you were in Baltimore, and I really enjoy seeing your editorials in the New England Journal and JAMA these days, and how active you are in trying to improve our knowledge of what's happening in the United States and some of the problems that we're having in the medical side of things. So I just want to thank you for coming and educating us on this topic that we probably wouldn't have thought about listening to. So I just wanted to thank you all from all of us at the University of Maryland, Dr. Dashi.
Thank you, Bob. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Here, here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
thank you,
Till
Dr.
next-
Adachi.
Till next year.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
That will be the
Stay
end
well.
for this Zoom link. So if everyone wants to close this and pop over to the Journal Club link, you will be seen there.
Bye-bye, Ellie.
Bye-bye.